Waiting. We all hate waiting. I don't care if you're young or old, boy or girl, left brain or right brain, we all hate waiting. Waiting comes in many different forms. It happens every day, and there's not one single person alive today that enjoys waiting. No one likes to wait, but what if waiting is a skill that we get worse at the more advanced our culture becomes? I'll give you an example. I see people send and receive texts and get frustrated when they have to wait more than a few seconds for the message to load. It's amazing to think that people used to communicate through these things called letters. Remember those? People actually took out a pen, wrote on some paper, sent it in the mail, and a few days later, it showed up at the person's house. Today, we send texts into thin air. It can travel hundreds of miles, and we can't wait a few seconds. We hate waiting. We've even become impatient with fast food. Oh, yes, it's true. Someone created this concept where you stay in your car, yell at a screen, drive around, and someone hands you a bag of food in a few minutes. But almost all of us, not me, when we drive up to McDonald's and see more than a few cars in line, what do? We bail, right? We think, this isn't communist Russia. I don't need to wait like this. And we drive off and go to the Taco Bell next door. We hate waiting. Or how about becoming parents and wanting to know the gender of your child? I hear couples say how frustrating it is they have to wait a few months to find this out. They say things like, oh, I wonder how we're going to ever decorate the room. Or, how will people know what kind of clothes to give at the shower? I want to know the gender of my baby, and I want to know it now. Folks, I hate to break it to you, but people have been having kids for thousands of years, and they've managed just fine. I think you'll manage. We hate waiting. We hate waiting in traffic. We hate waiting for test results. We hate waiting on a promotion. We hate waiting for YouTube videos to load. We hate waiting for advertisements. We hate waiting for a friend to make up their mind. We hate waiting at the DMV. We hate waiting for trailers before a movie. We hate waiting for apps to load. We hate waiting for a bus. We hate waiting. I want to slow down, though, and ask you a question. We have such a hard time waiting for everything else in life, and we become so impatient as a people. Do we have a hard time waiting for the one person who actually controls it all? Do we have a hard time waiting on God?
That is a ridiculous pet peeve that the advertisements on YouTube always load perfectly and the videos always don't load. It's like, what is this? How does this advertisement load perfectly and then I got to wait for the video? And think about how you feel when you walk into a restaurant and you say, how long is the wait time? And they say, it's 45 minutes. See you later. I'm out of here. How do you feel when you're sitting in traffic and someone runs by your car? You're like, something is wrong with this picture. How do you feel when you're on the phone and they say, you are 36th in line. Your call will be answered in the order that it was received. Your approximate wait time is 600 minutes, right? How do you feel when that happens? And we are used to instant gratification. Our culture is pushing us further and further towards that. Technology is putting things at our fingertips that just a couple decades ago people didn't even have. We have more information available to us within 30 seconds than people had available in the entire world only a couple of decades ago. Information, it doubles every 8 years, and now 60% of everything that we access on a mobile device available at our fingertips all the time. We have Netflix, 6,000 movies at our disposal. We have Hulu. We can watch any television show without being there at the time it was on. We have all of these things, and most of them are good, but they're training us to be terrible at waiting, to be bad at being patient, because we live in an on-demand world now that instantly gratifies everything we want when we want it. And I don't think people were ever really good at this, at waiting or being patient, but this instant culture we live in is killing our ability to be content, to be patient, to be able to wait. We say things like, I shouldn't have to wait, or I deserve better than this, or this place needs to get its act together because this wait is obnoxious, or this is 2014. Anything that comes after that sentence probably shows you're not good at waiting. I can't wait for this new movie. I can't wait for the iPhone 7 or the Xbox 700 or the, PS 17, whatever. I can't wait. I can't wait. I can't wait for the weekend. I can't wait until vacation. I can't wait for Christmas. I can't wait for this semester to be over. I can't wait to be in high school. I can't wait to be in college. I can't wait to get married. I can't wait to have a kid. I can't wait to get the promotion. And on and on and on. And we find ourselves having to wait, but not being able to do it very well. And a huge part of faith is waiting patiently on God and his promises. And today we're going to look at Abraham's life and see what we can learn about how he was able to wait patiently on God's promises. And I think if we could just learn a couple things from Abraham and just change our focus just a little bit and just change our priorities just a little bit, I think it would help us learn how to wait on God and how to be patient for his promises. It's about focus and priorities. And so the question is, what are you waiting on God for today? And how is that going for you? It is possible to wait in faith patiently on God. So I want to start by looking at this passage in Hebrews chapter 11 that talks about Abraham. And in this series, we're looking at sort of this hall of fame for the faithful chapter of Hebrews chapter 11. And it lists all these people who did this faith thing in amazing ways and what God commended about them. And so one of the things we see here about Abraham is the fact that he was very good at being patient and waiting. And so we're going to pick it up in Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 8 will be in the ESV. If you're on your mobile device, you can just click over to that. Otherwise, we'll have it on screen for you. And this is what it says. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was well past the age, since she was considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. And then it talks about in verse 13 all the people leading up to where this Abraham passage is. But this is what it says about him and the ones that came before him. It says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. And so we have Abraham, who's one of the first patriarchs. In fact, it's really an interesting thing. You know, he's sort of the great. He's 12 generations away from Noah-ish. And he's kind of the first person after Noah that really gets talked about as somebody who has faith. So we have 12 generations after Noah that we really don't talk about because there really isn't much to talk about in those generations. And Abraham is the first one, really, who starts to reconnect with God, sort of the way that Noah did, sort of the way that Enoch did, and kind of the people that we've already talked about a little bit. And it says that God called him to leave his homeland and go to a place that he didn't tell him where he was going. He said, Abraham, I want you to come with me. And what I'm going to do is, if you come with me, I'm going to make you the father of this great nation. And I'm going to bless the entire world through you. I'm going to give you a place to live, a very special place for this nation that I'm going to birth through you. There's a couple things going on here. First of all, Abraham and his wife were known for their barrenness up to this point. They weren't able to have children. It says that God called him to leave his father's homeland and go to a new place when he was 75 years old. So he had, for 75 years, tried to have children, and it says that they were unable to, that Sarah, his wife, was unable to have a child. And it says that God called him away. So the thing that he was known for was being childless. And when God calls him away, it says that he showed his faith by going before he even knew where God was taking him. But can you imagine God says to him, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to take the thing that you were known for, not being able to have children, and I'm going to flip that around, and I'm going to give you a child that's going to create this incredible nation of people. And it said Abraham went. It said he believed God's promise, and he went. Now, we think of that kind of in our time frame. We think like, oh, we have a job transfer, we move from here to here, and it's kind of not that big of a deal. It was a humongous deal in Abraham's time. When you lived in a tribe of people and you really relied on those people for safety, for food, for community, you were kind of connected and you were all relying on each other for survival. And for God to call him away from that took a really brave step for him to leave, and to not know where he was going made it even more incredible. And so he goes. It says that he believed God's promise. It was credited to him as righteousness, the fact that he had belief, and he goes. And it says, then God comes to him at a little bit later date there and kind of reconfirms the promise. And it's in Genesis 15 where it basically says, Abraham is talking to God, and he says, God, you promised to make me a great nation, but I still don't have an heir. And God promises him, I'm going to give you an heir. I'm going to give you a covenant son who we're going to be able to follow this son, and one day the entire world will be blessed, and one day I will give you this place to live, and one day you will become this great nation. And he says he has this encounter with God where he feels the weight of God's holiness, God's amazing kind of power and presence. And it says God puts him into this deep sleep, and he feels this sort of intense spirit. It says that he feels it's so heavy that it's almost like a darkness, that he feels so small in comparison to how big God is. And he has this amazing moment where he has this covenant. And what God asks him to do is to take some animals and to cut them in half. And then it says that God comes and makes this promise to Abraham. And it says he passes through the animals, and Abraham's able to kind of see all this, but to be shielded from God's huge presence. And it says that the covenant there is made in this intense moment where he has this incredible experience with God and kind of feels the bigness and the amazing size and scope of who God is. And then it says in the passage we just read that Abraham died in faith, that he waited patiently his whole life and never exactly received the fulfillment of the promise that God gave him. And I think in Abraham's life we see two pillars of faith that really kind of stand out to us, right? And these are out of those four pillars that we're talking about what faith looks like in a real world. And the two that we see, the first one is a holy reverence for a big God. And think about this for a second, okay? This word holy, it means to be set apart. And God has this concept for his people that he wants them to be set apart. And the first person that he really sets apart is Abraham. He tells them, I want you to leave what you know. I want you to leave what you're used to or what you're relying on. I want you to leave the family that you've kind of grown to be part of. And I want to set you apart unto me. I want to be your God, and I want to have a relationship with you. And this word holy means to be set apart unto God for us. And when we talks about God, it means to be set apart from anything else that we can conceive. In Leviticus it says, "You shall be holy unto me, for I am the Lord. I am holy, and I have separated you from all the other people, and you should be mine." Abraham's really the first person to understand this concept and to really move towards what it means to be set apart, because he has this holy reverence for a big God. And in Genesis 15, we talked about that experience. He felt God's weight and lived in that understanding of how big and powerful and huge and amazing and perfect God is. He had this holy reverence for a big God. And he lived as though God were capable of anything because of his holiness. And do you believe that God is capable of anything he wants? Because Abraham knew this. The second pillar is that he had a hopeful confidence in the promises of God. And really what that means, the word hopeful is kind of hard to exactly nail down, but it's as though Abraham lived as though what was promised was already fulfilled. That when God said, "Hey, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give you a land to live in. I'm going to bless the entire world through you." It's as though Abraham started living from that moment on as if that was already true. That he had this confidence in the promises of God that would carry him to change the way he lived based on the promise that was made. And I have some friends right now, and they're working through the process of adoption, right? And they're kind of waiting. They're in the moment now where they've kind of gone through the whole thing, and they're ready, and they've been approved, and now they're just waiting for this child to show up. And the child could show up tomorrow, or it could show up in 2 or 3 years from now. They're kind of in this process of just sort of waiting. But they know that this baby is coming. And they've changed the way they live based on the fact that this baby is coming, right? They've set up a room and designed it and got it ready for this new baby. They've kind of told all their friends already, "Hey, we're waiting, we're in this process, and would you pray with us? Would you be alongside of us? Would you support us?" Right? They've kind of started to stock some of the things they might need if all of a sudden an infant showed up tomorrow at their house. They've changed the way that they live based on the fact that they know this promised child is coming. And this is the way Abraham lived. He knew the promises that God made him were going to come. He changed the way he lived as though they were already here as he waited on them. And the promise that God made him was intense. It was huge, and it was partially fulfilled multiple times. And in fact, we're still waiting for some of this promise to be completely fulfilled. Take a look at the promise that was made to Abraham by God. He said, "I'm going to give you an offspring. It's going to be a nation of people as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous as the sand on a seashore. And I'm going to give you a place to live, a special place that's set apart just for your people. And I'm going to make you a blessing to all people." And when Abraham died, this is what he had. He had one covenant son named Isaac, and he knew that this covenant was going to go through Isaac. He lived in the land that he was going to receive, but as a nomad. And in fact, the only piece of land that he owned when he died was a burial plot for his wife. And he, I'm sure, couldn't have even understood the full scope of what it meant to be a blessing to all people, but he knew that promise was alive through his son. Now fast forward a couple more generations, a couple thousand years, and you see Israel come out of captivity and wander the desert, and they come into the promised land, the same land that Abraham was living in as a nomad, and they take possession of the land that God promised them. And God says to them, "I want you to be a nation of priests. I want you to take the information about who I am and how to relate to me, and I want you to tell the rest of the world what it means to be someone who follows God." So there's this partial fulfillment when Abraham dies, where he's just got this one son and he owns a very small piece of land, and he's really not been able to take hold of most of what this promise is. There's another partial fulfillment when Israel kind of like in a physical world really takes hold of a piece of land that God offered to them and gave them. And this idea of them being a nation of priests didn't really work out very well, but that was really kind of one idea of how this could be fulfilled. And then it goes even further, right? The offspring now of Abraham, as Jesus has come and he's renewed that covenant and he's made it new and he's offered it to everyone who has a relationship with him. Now the offspring, the nation of priests that Abraham is responsible for, is anyone who believes in Jesus. Now they receive the covenant that was first offered to Abraham. And the land that God has promised is heaven. It's this new Jerusalem, this new city on earth that God will create when the end finally comes. And the blessing to the entire world is really the legacy of Jesus. This idea that the entire world now has access to God, can be forgiven of sins, can get eternal life, can have a relationship with God, can find purpose and meaning in life through their relationship with God. And that's why we sing, Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham, and I'm one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. And then it's like, is that the Christian hokey pokey, right? Arm, left arm, right foot, left foot, spin around, sit down. I don't know. But that's the promise. And guess what? We are still waiting for this promised land to be fulfilled. We still wait for that to happen. That this promise that God made to Abraham was partially fulfilled multiple times, and the final fulfillment is still something that we see coming from a distance. It's this incredible promise that God made that just was so rich with meaning. And you can follow it through history and see what God is up to. And now we have access to God. And we have access to the same covenant that Abraham had access to. And I think there are three things that you see in Abraham's life that really help us understand how he was able to wait and potentially even die in faith with confidence that these promises would be fulfilled. And the first is this: Abraham lived motivated by a bigger vision. And I think we can live motivated by a bigger vision as well. Look at verse 10. It says, "For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. And if they'd been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one." And I think sometimes we can get very myopic, right? We can be focused on what is right in front of us. We can be focused on the next thing we're waiting for, or the big problem that we have that's sort of right here, standing in our way. And I think Abraham, he saw past, he looked up, he kind of got above what was going on in his everyday life, and he was able to see that there was a bigger thing happening here. I mean, if he wanted to create Abraham's city and the Abrahamites, he could have stayed where he was, taken possession of his father's sort of family and household, and eventually turned that into this huge complex and built walls, and it would have been the city of Abraham and the Abrahamites. But he saw there was something bigger in play here, that God had a bigger plan, a bigger vision for what was going on. And I think sometimes we're the same way. We see what's like right in front of us. We have this American dream that's kind of something we want, and so we want to make sure that we have the nice house and a couple cars, and we raise our kids and we put them through school, and we work really hard, and one day we want to retire with a nice big nest egg, so we have kind of established our own kingdom. And God says, I am building my kingdom all around you. There's the opportunity to have eternal impact all around you. And if you can get above what's right in front of you and see what's really going on and have a bigger vision for what's happening, the things that are right in front of you will become much smaller in comparison to what you are able to do in getting involved with building my kingdom and reaching people and having this eternal impact. And Abraham's impact was much more than a blip in history where he started his own little kingdom. It's this eternal impact that is affecting everyone who has faith in Jesus today. I mean, it's just this incredible idea that God is doing something bigger than what it seems like is going on right here in the moment. And he was motivated by this huge vision. And when we get this idea, our stuff becomes not just my stuff, it's our stuff, and not just my kingdom, it's God's kingdom. And it's not just enough to have a nice house and a couple cars and raise and put my kids through school and retire to this nice big nest egg. It's like, I want to have eternal impact, and I want to be part of God's kingdom, and I want to see this grow, and I want to see people affected, and I want to know that what I poured my life into had some eternal value beyond just this little blip in history. There's so much more going on. There's eternal impact to be made all around. We have to look up, and we have to see the bigger vision. So that's one thing, live motivated by the bigger vision, but he also lived focused on the guarantor. Look at verse 10. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God, not whose designer and builder is Abraham. He was focused on God as the guarantor of the promise. And listen, God, this is a truth that you can hang on to. God has never broken or forgotten or not fulfilled completely a promise that he has made. He is the perfect guarantor of any promise that he makes. And I think sometimes we have a hard time understanding this because we play this out in a real world where I make a promise to somebody and I'm human, and they make a promise to me and they're human, and we fail each other. My parents have failed me. My brother has failed me. I have failed them. My wife has failed me. I have failed her. We aren't perfect in guaranteeing and fulfilling and following through on our promises, but God is. He is the perfect guarantor. He has never broken a promise. He has never forgotten a promise. He has never partially fulfilled a promise that he did not mean to completely fulfill at some point. And says that Abraham, when God made the promise, it says he believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. And the promise, we know, is only as good as the person who's guaranteeing it. And in that moment in Genesis 15 where God had said, I want you to take these animals and I want you to cut them in half. I want you to lay him out. And he came down and he passed through. It seems like this really barbaric, archaic, disgusting kind of thing. But in Abraham's day, when people made a covenant with each other, this was called cutting a covenant. And what they would do is they would take an animal, cut it in half, lay it out, prepare it, and two people would make a promise to each other, and two people would walk between these two halves of an animal, and they were saying to each other, I'm going to fulfill this promise, and if I don't fulfill this promise, let the same thing that's happened to this animal happen to me. That if I don't fulfill the promise that I'm making to you right now as we cut this covenant, let me be cut in half. Let me have the same fate as this animal. And when God comes down and makes this covenant with Abraham, he doesn't make a promise to Abraham, and then Abraham makes a promise back to him. God comes down and he says, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to make you an incredible nation, even though you've been fatherless, even though you had no son. I'm going to bless the entire world through you. I'm going to give you a place to live that's going to be just for your people. And it's not contingent on what you do. I am the one who will make the promise, and I am the one who will guarantee it, and I am the one who will perfectly fulfill it. And it says Abraham believed and he was credited as being righteous. And I think Abraham, he wasn't perfect. Sometimes we think he was perfect. But he lived focused on the guarantor, and he lived with a bigger vision in mind. I've been trying to explain the concept of patience to my 3-year-old. It's like impossible. It's like the hardest thing in the world to explain to somebody with that level of understanding what it means to be patient. But I found a way to do this. We have, iPads and iPhones in our house, and there's like little apps that my son loves to use. And one of those apps is a Bible app. And when you click on the Bible story that you want to see and hear and play with, right, it loads. And one day I was kind of watching Miles, and he was kind of like worked up, and so I said, okay, you can play with it. And he sat down, and I saw him push it, and then it was like loading, and it was like taking a long time to load. And I'm like, he's going to explode. This is not going to work out well. This kid's ready to just blow right now. He needs this in the moment, right now, to do what. And I said, it's just taking a minute, buddy. It's okay. He looks at me, Dad, and he goes, Dad, it's loading. I'm like, what? Yeah, it's loading. It's fine. And he just watches it load. And then he knew that when it was done loading that it would pop up. He understood that, like, as the bar starts to move across the screen, he knows he's getting closer and closer and closer to actually having it pop up for him. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. So a couple days later, we're at the doctor's office, and I needed him to sit and be quiet and be patient for a moment, for like a minute, so we could talk to the doctor and get that done. And I said to him, buddy, I need you to be quiet, and I need you to be patient. I need you to act like things are loading right now. I want you to know it's loading, okay? And he's like, okay. And he sat there, and he was patient for just a minute, and he understood the idea that it's loading. And I want you to understand that sometimes when we're focused on the guarantor and we're waiting on that promise, it can be excruciating. Think about some of the things that you might be waiting on. I mean, you might be waiting on some salvation for somebody that you love. You might be waiting on a child. You might be waiting on a spouse. You might be waiting on something huge and important, and that's just so difficult, and it just rips your heart out every day as you wait. But I want you to know that if God promises, it's a matter of waiting for it to load. It's a matter of waiting and knowing that God will fulfill the promise that he makes. That it isn't possible for him to not fulfill a promise. That it isn't possible for him to not fulfill it completely. That he's perfect. That he does it every time. That he never makes a mistake. He never goes back on his word. He never leaves you hanging. But the issue is that we live focused on him, and we live motivated by this bigger vision, but we also have to find a way to live submitted to his timing. Look at verse 13. These all died in faith, never having received the things that were promised, but they saw them and they greeted them from afar. And they acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on this earth. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And Abraham lived as though those promises had already been fulfilled. For him, the promise was the reward, not the fulfillment of the promise. For him, it wasn't the fulfillment of the promise, it was the promise that was his reward. To know that God was in it with him, to know that God had promised him something, to know that God saw him and was active in his life. And Abraham wasn't perfect. I mean, as he waited for this first covenant son, he waited 25 years from the time that he had this incredible experience with God, from the time that happened to the time that he received Isaac. And you can think about what was going through his mind as that happened. In fact, about 10 years into this 25 years of waiting, he makes a terrible decision, and he decides to rush it and try to fulfill God's promise for him. And he takes his wife's maidservant, and he has a child that's not going to be the covenant child by trying to fulfill God's promise for God. And then he waits longer, and God comes to him and he says, that's not the covenant child. I'm going to bless you with your own child. And it turns out that he has Isaac when he's 100 years old, and his wife is 90. 90 years waiting for an offspring that would produce this great nation. 100 years waiting for this covenant son. And he's not perfect. I mean, he made mistakes. We see him rushing the fulfillment of that. We see him making other mistakes. And I don't think God expects perfection from us. But if we're able to live motivated by this bigger vision and focused on the guarantor and submitted to God's timing, we too can wait patiently. And this is Abraham's faith on display. Take a look at this. This is near the end of his life, after he's lived the whole thing and seen how faithful God can be. It says this, by faith, when he was tested, he offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So he had known that Isaac was the way that God was going to fulfill his promise. And when God said to him, I want you to offer Isaac up as a sacrifice to me, at this point, having gone through his whole life and having had this relationship with God and having seen God sustain him in a new land and remind him that he was going to receive it and then give him a son when it was impossible, when it was a miracle, he said, I can do this. I have the faith for it. And says verse 19, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. It says that when God asked him to sacrifice his covenant son that he had waited 100 years to receive, that he did it. That he had already put into his mind that he was going to follow through on what God asked him to do. That if God had him follow through on sacrificing Isaac, that he knew that this promise would be fulfilled, and it would be fulfilled through Isaac, and he knew that God would have to bring him back from the dead, and he thought that was completely possible based on the relationship that he had with God. It's amazing that he can get to this point after seeing what God is capable of. And I wonder if we're having a hard time being patient in our culture, in our everyday life. What are you having a hard time waiting on? Is it salvation for someone that you've been praying for? A child, a friend, a loved one? Is it healing? You just pray for God to heal your body completely, or to heal someone that you love, that you're close to? Are you waiting on a spouse where you cry out to God and you say, God, I just want this person. I'm ready for this person. Maybe a new job. Maybe you're praying for God to sustain you and to give you what you need. Maybe you're looking for a way out of a pattern of sin. Or potentially you're waiting for a child. And what I want you to know is that God doesn't necessarily promise any of these things to us. He doesn't say, I will do this for you. He doesn't say, I will give you each one of these things. But Jesus encourages us to pray boldly and persistently about these kinds of things, and reminds us that God is like a dad who loves to give good gifts to his children. And this is what God does promise us while we're waiting. The things that we can hold on to while we're waiting. He promises to listen to us as we pour out our heart. He promises never to leave or forsake us. He promised to give us purpose. He promises the fullest possible life available. He promises to empower us, to give us the Holy Spirit, to carry us through tough times, to give us the power to accomplish what he's called to do. He promises to love us without condition. He promises us relationship and eternal life. And while we're waiting, when we see the bigger vision, when we're focused on the guarantor, when we're able to be submitted to God's timing, while we're waiting, we can hold on to those promises that have been fulfilled, that are being fulfilled every single day in our life, while we pray persistently and boldly for the other things that we are waiting for God on. So what are you waiting faithfully for? What are you welcoming from a distance? And are you living motivated by a bigger vision, focused on a guarantor, submitted to God's timing? And is the promise of the reward enough for you?